Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and D.C. Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome. We're here today with David Enrich, who is the author of Murder the Truth and a New York Times reporter. So, David, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about sort of what you do on the day job, and then we'll get into the book, because this is not your first time publishing. So we want to hear a little bit more about that in context. But tell us what's going
on. So as you said, I work at the New York Times. I run a small team of investigative reporters. And I currently work in the business section. So it's primarily business related things, but it's, we have a pretty broad understanding of what constitutes a business story. And I do some of my own reporting and writing as well. And so, as you mentioned, this is my 4th book, and the others have been about law firms, big banks, things like that.
Uh-huh. So tell us a little bit about Murder the Truth, which it's in bookstores now, and they can get it in all the usual places, Amazon and so forth. But tell us more about what this book is about.
So at its core, the book is about how there is a really broad, aggressive, and increasingly successful campaign by rich and powerful people to muzzle journalists and others who write critical things or uncover uncomfortable secrets about people with power and money. And more specifically, it is about the Supreme Court's case decision in 1964 in New York Times versus Sullivan, which has enabled basically most investigative journalism today. But it's also looking at, and across the country, how a lot of small local publishers and independent journalists are increasingly under just tremendous pressure from people that they write about, who are using legal threats and lawsuits to intimidate and punish and deter them. And the book tells the stories of quite a few journalists who are, not working at places like the New York Times, where they've just been kind of driven to the financial and in some cases psychological brink because of threats and litigation they've faced as a result of, just really doing very good and fearless journalism. And they've paid a really steep price for that. And one of the kind of theses of the book, I guess, is that kind of journalism, A, is really important, and B, it's increasingly under threat. And that's not just like with a local newspaper. It includes independent journalists, people with a Substack or a podcast, and we've just seen this explosion in kind of new voices on the media scene in the past several years, and which I think is a really healthy, cool trend. And it's really good for democracy, and it's really good for the mainstream media to face new sources of competition. Absolutely. But the weaponized lawfare that I write about in this book poses a really existential threat to that kind of journalism, I believe.
Well, and I wholeheartly agree. And I think there's a couple things that I wanted to bring up. I love the use of the term lawfare, and I think we're seeing that more and more when we look at, anti-SLAPP statutes not really keeping up with the weaponization of the courts and stifling free speech. When we also and sort of some of the broader economic trends that are putting a lot of pressure on small newsrooms. There's only, if we look at Maryland, Delaware, and D.C., where MDDC is based, 90% of our newsrooms are 5 to 7 people.
Yeah.
And the stakes are really high. If you get sued at a newsroom that has a margin like a 5 to 7 person newsroom would, it can be devastating. And so tell me a little bit about the chilling effects that you've seen in those small spaces. And when we think about small spaces, that's really local news. So they're really super close to what's happening in the fray.
Well, just to back up for 1 second, and I think it might be worth just saying how I got onto this project in the first
Oh,
place, which
of
is that,
course. Yeah.
well, no, it's relevant to what we're talking about here, which is why I bring it up. And so basically at the New York Times, I started noticing, and really in like the early 2020s, that basically every time we were tackling an important, what we felt was an important topic that involved a rich or powerful person or institution, we were getting bombarded with these legal threat letters and occasionally
Mm,
getting sued. And you know, the New York Times has like a lot of lawyers. We have a lot of experience dealing with that stuff. It's so we're okay. But I had just started wondering what that experience was like at a local level, or if you're an independent journalist. And so I can't remember if I contacted you or not, but I reached out to the press
we
associations
have
in
talked. Yeah.
almost all
Hmm.
states, all over the country, and just started asking what they were seeing. And a lot of people, and sorry, you might have been one of those people. I just cannot remember. But I got connected as I talked to people at the press associations. I got connected to a ton of local journalists, local
Hmm.
publishers, local media lawyers. And yet I just started hearing these crazy stories. And it ranges. So this brings me to the chilling effect.
Hmm.
And it ranges from, there's a case I detail in the book involving a guy named Scott Stedman who doesn't work for a news outlet. He created his own news outlet called Forensic News, and made the mistake of like writing, well, not the mistake, but he made what turned out to be a fateful decision to start writing about Russian oligarchs and people who enabled them. He faced lawsuits, he faced threats, and he just couldn't take it. And after years of litigation and threats, and he, after having had to check himself into a hospital to deal with debilitating panic attacks as a result of this, decided to just quit journalism altogether. Uh, and so there are a handful of stories in the book like that, and a kind of a more mundane but like equally pernicious thing is I tell the story about a local paper in Colorado where a reporter there was doing some really kind of intrepid journalism about environmental risks posed and safety risks posed by a big real estate development in
Hmm.
his town. And, the reporting was dogged. I've gone through his notes. I've gone through I've seen all of his interviews. I've re-interviewed some of the people. I've been to the site that he wrote about, and his reporting was solid. I'm not
Hmm.
saying that it was complete, like there wasn't another side to the story. There was, and he captured it, but it was a solid set of investigative reporting. The local real estate development company hired a very high priced law firm that started bombarding this small paper with threats and threatened litigation. It started using the State Open Records Act to try and identify his sources.
Mm.
And the paper, which was owned by a local billionaire, quickly got cold feet and started preventing him, or at least diluting what he was writing, and in some cases, killing stories altogether. So that's another type of chilling effect. And the list goes on. These come in all different shapes and sizes, but the end result is that people who are writing and institutions that are writing about powerful local or national or even international figures are feeling like they basically face a choice between uh, risking their livelihoods or their publication's livelihood on the one hand, or backing down in the face of threats and either not covering things that they think are important, or at least kind of diluting their coverage.
Sure.
And both of those outcomes are just like completely at odds with what I think the First Amendment is all about.
100%. And I think, when you kind of follow those threads, even if someone is deciding, okay, well, we're going to spend the money to fight these lawsuits and so forth, that is taking time away from other work that they
Yeah.
could and should be doing. It is making, trying to find out who the sources are, that's making sources more reluctant to come
Yeah.
forward and to be a part of it, as well as, sort of grinding down on the economic well-being of the news publication. So when you think of that, and it feels so stark, like how can someone abuse the legal system in this way? It kind of begs the question: how can people get away with this? And what's wrong with the system? Or is it just a compilation of a lot of different things? Or is there one sort of smoking gun that you're like, oh well, this is the problem, let's fix that?
No, I don't think it's that simple, unfortunately. And I think that there are, look, the United States has some of the best press freedom protections in the world. Right? The First Amendment is very powerful, and the Supreme Court has enforced it quite rigorously, I think, over the years. The problem is that there's just like a real power imbalance, I think, between the people doing the journalism, and it's not just journalists, by the way, right? It's, and I realize we're both journalists, and this is probably for primarily an audience of journalists, but it's also just like a local person who circulates an online petition about a real estate
Right.
project or like writes a nasty restaurant review on Yelp. And there's a whole range of just public speech that is protected by the First Amendment, but that is increasingly being challenged by weaponized lawsuits. But so I think that part of the problem is that there's just a huge power asymmetry between the
Mhm.
journalists or just members of the public who are doing the writing and doing the criticizing and doing the investigating on the one hand, and then often the people or institutions that are the subjects of what they're writing. And so, it's like if you are someone with $100 million and you don't like the coverage in your local paper or in a local blog or in a local Substack newsletter, it is not that expensive for you to send a threatening
Right.
letter, even to file a lawsuit, even if you know that you're going to lose, even if the state you live in has a relatively strong anti-slap law,
Mhm.
and you're going to end up
Still
having
worth a
to
try.
cover attorney fees. You have $100 million. Like, you're going to
Yeah.
pay what, like 10, 20, $100,000 maybe? That may well be a price worth winning on the off chance that you can, even in an unsuccessful lawsuit, even when it gets anti-slapped, you can still drive up by a huge amount the cost of that publication or that journalist has to pay, because their libel insurance, when it comes up for renewal, the insurer is going to see you got sued, and I'm sure they care whether you win or lose, but I've seen this over and over again. People that survive these lawsuits and get them dismissed or win on summary judgment, they are still seeing, when their liable insurance comes up for renewal, the rates are going through the roof, the
Mhm.
deductibles are going through the roof, and so it's a financial price that publications, especially small ones, pay for years into the future, and it creates it forces people to make a really uncomfortable choice between jeopardizing their financial health and sticking to their guns. And I don't really know what the solution is to that. I mean, this is kind of self-serving, but I think one solution is to like educate first journalists and then
Mhm.
secondarily a broader swath of the public about the importance of not only free speech, because I think everyone recognizes that kind of conceptually,
Mhm.
but the importance of cases like New York Times versus Sullivan, and really understanding the context and history of those cases and the threats to them that we're seeing playing out kind of all over the country right now on a micro level, which it really adds up to something. And I think it's not by accident. This is something that is not just kind of one thing happening over here, another thing happening over there randomly. It's like this is a part of I think, a concerted effort, primarily on the right, to make it harder for journalists, whether they work at a place like the New York Times or have a Substack,
Mhm.
to speak truth to power. And I think that's a really dangerous trend that we're seeing right now.
Well, and I want to get to New York Times versus Sullivan, but I first want to go back to sort of the landscape as smaller newspapers close and you lose local journalism,
Yeah,
whether it's through the economic pressures, whether it's through lawsuits or whatnot, what that means for communities. I think Pew did a great research study now, a couple years old, that shows that the incidence of corruption
yeah,
and malfeasance on the part of local governments just skyrocket. Can you talk a little bit about sort of
yeah.
what happens when the worst happens?
It's really interesting because, so first of all, there's all this rich anecdotal evidence of what happens in various communities. And I've actually seen that in my community. I mean, I live just outside of New York City, and we lost our local papers a couple years ago. They just went out of business.
Mhm.
And they've actually now started up again under different ownership and a different name, which is great. But in those intervening periods, it was just incredible to see the misinformation flourishing. And the primary local news source became Facebook. And there was a Facebook group where, for our zip code, basically, where people were sharing information, asking questions, and it was just like nonsense was prevailing. All these
Yeah.
conspiracy theories and about like stupid stuff, like about like there was a new sidewalk being, or a new crosswalk being installed, and there's like a huge conservative outcry about how the way that was being painted was going to be dangerous. And it goes on. It's on both the right and the left, but it was like no one was being served by it. And the existence of the local newspaper and the return of the local newspaper did not solve that problem, but it
Mhm.
made it better. And so I saw that up close and personal. I know everyone has kind of their own stories about this, but the interesting thing here, and you kind of alluded to this, is that there's really good data on it as well.
Mhm.
That, I mean, as you said, the kind of civic participation in general declines sharply when a town or a community loses a reliable local news source, and voter registration and voting turnout goes down, misinformation goes up, prices tend to go up, and there's just all sorts of bad direct consequences. Corruption goes up, and all sorts of kind of direct causal connections between losing a reliable source of news and just people not only being informed, but having someone to kind of call balls and strikes,
Right.
and to hold people accountable when they abuse their power. It's so important, and I mean, obviously this is happening all over the country right now. So
Right, and such a sort of free for all forum like you have on social media, which does not have a legal burden to vet, to vouch for anything
yeah.
that is posted on their platform. You know, news media does have sort of a moral standard, but it also has a legal standard that
Mm.
they are responsible for what they post, and so you get better sourcing, stronger reporting, you know, rather than me just spouting off to be like, I don't like the way
Yeah.
that's gonna go. So I'm gonna grind on it. Um,
Also, just in general, I mean, I think having people who are professional journalists, and again, that takes many different shapes and sizes. That does not mean you need to have gone to J school. It does not mean you have to work at an actual newspaper. But people who have view themselves as professional journalists and take the standards seriously, that makes a huge difference. And as opposed to people who are just like pissed off about something and take to Facebook to complain about it, and then that's treated as a source of news when it's just not, right. And it's not about me agreeing or disagreeing with that person's perspective, but it's just not a reliable source of information. Anyway,
yeah.
I'm preaching to the choir here, sorry.
No, no, no. But I just a little detour there. Like, I think, you know, there's also another study that talks about how few Americans actually know any
Yeah.
journalists. And
Yep.
granted, the news media world has shrunk substantially, and all the local news ecosystems report and the news desert reports show that. But we sort of talk about at our press association sort of the act of journalism and adhering to those professional standards of journalism. But how much of, or do you think that some of this is related to just a lack of media literacy and a lack of kind of understanding about at a core level what journalism is?
I think it's both. I think also, and here's a little bit of like self-criticism, not of me personally, but of the media in general. I mean, I think that the media in general has been a little like exclusionary in the
Mhm.
past in terms of who we treat as one of our own. And
Right.
so, the act of journalism to me is providing valuable, trusted information to the public and bringing stuff to light that might not otherwise come to light. That's and right now we've obviously got an explosion of new kind of mediums to do that in, whether it's social media or a podcast or whatever. And just because someone is purely operating on that level, to me, doesn't mean they're not a journalist. It just means maybe we've been a little too narrow in how we conceive of journalists. And I think if you frame it that way and you try to imbue someone who is bringing stuff to light consistently on social media, that they too are a journalist. Maybe that, first of all, that kind of solves the problem of who, like, you've never met a journalist. Well, yes, you have. Like, but it also, I think, by treating people with the respect that they deserve and taking them seriously, even when they are doing something that is, not exactly how I was raised to be a journalist or you were raised to be a journalist. I think maybe giving them that benefit of the doubt and taking them seriously and listening to them and hearing them, that may be some of our standards that we've been trained on and I think are really valuable will rub off a little bit,
Mhm.
and they'll take themselves more seriously and realize this is not just it's not always just about getting clicks and getting retweets or whatever. It's about being a trusted source, and that's how you build credibility, and that's how you really get your message to be taken seriously.
Yeah, no. Well, and I want to go to New York Times versus Sullivan because that is sort of that bulwark. Like that's what everything rests on in terms of
Yeah,
investigative reporting. So for people who are not up on that case, 1964, you know,
yeah.
we're going into the Wayback Machine. Tell us why it's important and what it is.
I mean, do you want me to tell you a little bit about the history? I know, I'm
Yeah,
sure you
let's
know,
go
but
for it.
yeah, okay.
We got some
I mean,
time.
it's just such a good story, I think. Okay, so in 1960, a full page ad ran in the New York Times and it was paid for by supporters of Martin Luther King. And it was basically a fundraising appeal to pay for like voter registration drives in the South. And the ad, if you can just like Google it online, it's called Heed Their Rising Voices. And you can see it for yourself. I mean, it's a lot of kind of small print text. And it in the small print text, it kind of describes this litany of abuses committed by racist Southern officials
Mhm.
who were essentially trying to preserve white supremacy in the South. And you know, the gist of the ad is completely true. Most of the facts in the ad are true, but some of them are wrong or exaggerated. And so there are points where they're detailing the racist and kind of violent behavior of Southern officials where they got some facts wrong. And so the ad ran, and it came to the attention of a guy named L.B. Sullivan, who was basically in charge of the police force in Montgomery, Alabama.
Mhm.
And Sullivan was not named in the ad. No one was named in the ad, in fact. But the Montgomery, Alabama police force was rightly among the places that was like very severely condemned because they were doing terrible things. However, a couple of the smaller details about the Montgomery police force were wrong, and so Sullivan sued the New York Times for $500,000, which at the time was a lot of
That's
money.
a lot of money.
And, yeah, and I mean it still is a lot of money for me, but at the
Me
time it
too.
was a very large amount of money for the New York Times. And so the case went to trial in Montgomery in a courtroom presided over by a white supremacist judge, and with jurors who were white, and some of them were dressed in Confederate costumes.
Mm.
And you'll not be surprised to hear that they quickly returned a verdict in favor of L.B. Sullivan and against the New York Times.
Mhm.
And so that $500,000 verdict, I mean, first of all, it sent a very loud signal to the New York Times that they could not afford to face more lawsuits like this. And so
Mhm.
they pulled their reporters out of Alabama. They urged them to stop writing about institutional racism in the
Mhm.
South. So there's a very clear chilling effect. And on the flip side, other people in the South saw the success that Sullivan had, and it inspired this horde of copycat lawsuits against other national news outlets. So, like the big TV broadcasters, for example. And
Mhm.
it was an explicit effort to basically make it so financially painful to operate in the South and to write about the South that it led other outlets to kind of tamp down on their coverage of the civil rights movement. So it was a very deliberate campaign
Mhm.
by Southern officials to kind of muzzle the national press. Anyway, the Times appealed the decision. The state Supreme Court turned them down. And so that left one option, which was the US Supreme Court. And in 1964, the court heard the case and then unanimously decided the case against Sullivan and for the New York Times. So they reversed the lower court's decisions.
Mhm.
And the Supreme Court's rationale was really interesting and important. So basically, they found that in a democracy that values free speech, people need to have the breathing room to be able to like aggressively and sharply criticize and interrogate and investigate people who hold power. So like especially government officials.
Mhm.
And if there is a cloud of litigation hanging over you every time you write about someone, that if you get a fact or two wrong by mistake, you're going to get sued into oblivion. You will very quickly decide not to write about that kind of stuff, or you will cease to exist because you will be sued so many times. And
Right.
so the court said they were going to basically create a much higher bar for lawsuits like that to prevail. And so they created what's become known as the actual malice standard,
Mhm.
which is not really about malice in the common sense of the word. The standard is basically that if you're a public figure or public official and you are suing someone for defamation, you need to prove a couple things. So obviously, first of all, you need to prove that the facts at issue were incorrect, and you also need to prove that your reputation was injured, which is those are kind of obvious. What was less obvious is that you had to also, on top of that, prove that whoever spoke or wrote these defamatory falsehoods either knew that what they were writing was false. So in
Mhm.
other words, they were lying, or acted with reckless disregard for the accuracy of what they were writing. So basically, you either had to be prove that the person was lying or was just being super reckless and irresponsible about what they were doing.
Mhm.
And again, you could still prove that, right? There's still lots of libel
Absolutely.
lawsuits that
Mhm.
showed when journalists were reckless or spreading false information or lies. You could be held accountable. But it also meant that public officials could not just run around like seizing on like a small inaccuracy or something that was inadvertent or that it really truly was by mistake and put someone out of business for doing that. And so this really it ushered in this kind of golden age of journalism. It really brought on the investigative journalism era
Mhm.
in the US. It was not coincidence that reporters like started uncovering huge wrongdoing in Vietnam.
Right.
There was Watergate, and these things were all, you know, they were a result of many things, but they were also a direct result of Sullivan. They would not have been able to happen without the legal protections that the Supreme Court had granted.
And then you have the anti-SLAPP statutes that you
Right.
see in many states now. I think 34 that also provide a mechanism to quickly dismiss if they
Yeah.
are SLAPP suits that. But it does feel like everything old is new again. Sort of the uh, landscape that you just discussed in the early '60s is what you're basically saying is happening now with
Yeah.
rich and powerful people across, not just in one area of the country or around one issue, but across the board. And we have a very different Supreme Court now. So,
Yeah.
what does um, uh, Times versus Sullivan, do you feel like it's at risk now? Where is it now, and where is it going?
Well, where it's at now is it still exists in all its glory, right?
Mhm,
And but what's happened is that there has been a really well-oiled campaign in the past decade to try and build support for overturning it, and so which has had a bunch of success. So we've got now at least two Supreme Court justices, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, who have publicly said in opinions that they want to overturn it. We
mhm,
have a whole lot of lower court judges and like federal appeals court judges on down at both the federal and state level who have endorsed the call to overturn it. We have groups like the Heritage Foundation, the Claremont Institute, the Federalist Society, both at a national level and at state and local levels, pushing their members to do research and academic work to kind of undercut the ideas of Sullivan. And you've got lawyers who are aligned in this, bringing more and more suits, not only because they want to win money for their clients, but also because they're looking for appropriate vehicles to get to the Supreme Court to overturn Sullivan. And one of the things, and I don't know if it's going to be successful or not at the Supreme Court level, but already what we're seeing is that, normally a case that fails, a lawsuit that clearly fails to meet the threshold of Sullivan, a judge would normally just dismiss that very quickly, regardless of the actual facts of the case, right? If there is not any evidence alleged in the actual lawsuit that the person acted with quote unquote actual malice,
mhm.
the case is out, right? It's just like not really that hard. And what
Right.
I've been seeing, and I do not have data on this, but what I've been seeing anecdotally, and I've been hearing from a lot of lawyers on the ground, is that process of getting things dismissed has really slowed down. And I
Mhm,
think part of the reason it's slowed down is that there are more and more judges at both the state and federal level who are kind of taking up Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch's arguments and citing them in their opinions. And so that means, at a practical level, for journalists or news outlets or anyone else who faces these lawsuits, that these things are just a lot more painful and expensive and long lasting to deal with. Uh, and that's with Sullivan still being the law of the land. And look, there are at least two votes to overturn it. I obviously don't have a crystal ball and I have a lousy track record of predicting these things, I don't know if there are two or three more votes. I mean, one shorter term kind of intermediate option might be, and again, this is me speculating, but
mhm,
might be for the court not to take a look at overturning Sullivan outright, but you kind of chip away around the edges at some of the subsequent cases that like kind of cemented and expanded Sullivan's
mhm.
reach, um, which I think would be dangerous for a lot of reasons. But I mean, the bottom line is that even with Sullivan right now, because of this kind of orchestrated attack that I describe in the book, there is it is having a real kind of squeezing effect
Sure.
on a lot of journalists, especially those who work for smaller outlets or out there on their own.
Well, it sounds like everyone or across the country, on a local level, people are sort of testing and chipping away and sort of, and judges are kind of buying into that and being like, "Huh, is this the one? Is this how
Yeah,
what are the parameters?" And at the very least, that multitude of cases is setting precedent and narrowing as it goes along. And the net effect for your local journalist who's trying to uncover something within one's own community is that they don't have the time because their attention
yeah,
is being pulled in other ways. They're worried about fiscal attack, and they ultimately are not going to be successful, and the whole community loses out. And so that sort of is what you're examining in the book. Uh,
Yeah, exactly.
so, how did you stay peppy in your life to write such a depressing book? I mean, that's a really grim picture, and yet you get up
Uh,
and report every day. How are you managing?
I I don't know. I've never thought about it that way. I mean, I have a lovely wife and two lovely kids and a lovely dog, and the sun is shining a lot. And I don't know. I've got to say, like, no one's asked me that question actually, and I guess it's kind of obvious. But I think I did like really draw energy from the reporting of this
Mhm,
book and the writing of this book because, like, I really I feel passionately about it. I've been a journalist my entire adult life. I care about this, and I felt that it was important for someone who I'm in a position of relative power because I work at the New York Times and I have a big
mhm,
book publisher behind me to really kind of start to examine some of these big law firms, for example, that are by their nature litigious and have been
mhm,
leading this charge to not only sue and threaten people, but to try to overturn Sullivan. But I also just like around the country, I had like so many incredible conversations and meetings with just really inspiring local journalists who, in some cases, have stood up against just enormous odds and have often like prevailed. I mean, they've been ground down and they have like faced just incredible stress and anxiety and sometimes really like actual tangible bad health effects as a
mhm,
result of this and certainly bad financial effects, and they are just like committed to their jobs, and their jobs are harder than mine in a lot of ways, right?
mhm.
I mean, I work really hard,
The
but
grit and
like
determination of the local news journalist that is like
yeah,
wolves at the door and trying to cover everything. It
it's
astounds all of us.
inspiring.
It
It's
is.
inspiring. It inspired me a lot, and it like uh I'm a pretty motivated person, so it's not like I needed motivation to do this, but I did draw a lot of inspiration from that, and I mean, there's just a lot of courageous local journalism going on, and it that is what makes our democracy work in large part, and so
Yeah, and every national issue was once a local issue. I work a
for
lot
sure.
on the state level, and I'm always telling our member publications, if you hear something that's happening on the local level, chances are it's going to bubble up to the state level, and then it bubbles on up
Yeah.
to the national level. It all starts in those local communities, and so I wanted to kind of look now to the future. You paint this picture of this diminishing effectiveness of New York Times versus Sullivan. We've sort of ascertained there's no simple answer, there's no like root cause. What do you suggest people do? I mean, it can't just be love your local journalist. It can't necessarily just be stand up and speak truth to power when you can. What do you think is what are the tools in the quiver or the arrows in the quiver?
I don't know. There's everyone asks me that question, and I don't have a good answer, I'm afraid. Like, I think, I mean, this is self-serving. You can read books like mine and like educate yourself on these issues and kind of spread the word. I do think I mean, not to buy my book, go to a library, get my book or whatever, but like read about these topics, understand the detail and the nuance behind these Supreme Court cases. And in part because it helps you understand their importance and the many ways they protect you, whether you're a journalist or not.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think just like, look, I think for those of your listeners who are in the media, like, I think certainly at a national level, I think there's obviously been a huge crisis in trust or lack of trust in the media, which has been growing for a while now, but it's really reached, I think, very bad proportions at this point. And I think that journalists, especially on the national level, really need to do a better job of looking in the mirror and thinking about how we got into this mess, because some of it's driven by external stuff. It's driven by people like Trump who are actively seeking to delegitimize us and weaken us because, doing so makes it easier for them to spread lies and distortions and conspiracy theories. But part of it's our fault. And I think we have institutionally or across the industry really not been as good as we need to at owning up to mistakes. We're like good at correcting like factual errors and things like that generally, but we're not as good when we get kind of a line of coverage maybe a little bit wrong.
Right.
Or we have everyone's got their biases. I have mine, I'm sure you have yours. And sometimes those biases affect how we're writing about broad topics. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's like, and it's kind of unavoidable, but like, I think there have been times there, in fact, definitely have been times where I think those biases, sometimes subconsciously, have led us to come down too hard on a person or an institution, and other times to not be tough enough. And I think it's really healthy for the media to be looking in the mirror and figuring out new and transparent ways to deal with that and to allow ourselves to be held accountable. And I think that would really help with some of the lack of trust that has built up over the years.
Mhm.
Again, I don't really know how to do that. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about that and talking with colleagues about that. And the problem is that when we are candid about our mistakes and things we'd like to do differently, oftentimes in this like super polarized partisan environment,
Right.
that just becomes ammunition for a bad faith attacks. And so I don't know. It's really complicated. I wish I had a good, clean answer, but I don't.
Well, and I mean, if you had a really good, clean answer, then you would have written another book about it, and we'd have our marching
Yeah,
orders, and life would be good. It
yeah,
occurs to me though that like where you sort of you go to the heat, and you also think about where you can exert the most control. Like when the world is chaotic, I find my world shrinking a little bit and thinking about, okay, well, what can I do here? Like I literally cannot focus on what's happening in faraway places that nobody cares what I think.
yeah,
But I can look to my local publication or my local media landscape and think about, okay, how am I contributing to this? Like,
yeah,
how are my actions affecting? And that's such an unsatisfying answer because it's not like well, if we just do this, it'll be better. But just as though that concerted, orchestrated effort, and I think it's really important to have books like Murder the Truth because you're taking all of those disparate little case studies and incidents and painting this big picture about this is what's happening. But then it also has to drill back down
yeah,
and say, okay, well, we do have to look in the mirror locally. We have to, provide support. We have to look at, are there legislative things that we can do at the local level
yeah.
to sustain, to support, and see it sort of hopefully bubble up again? Because the stakes are really high. I mean, when we look at the injustices that Times versus Sullivan helped to usher in that golden age of
Yeah.
reporting, I don't think anybody wants to go back to a time where all that's swept under the rug, no matter the political stripe. And so I think, Murder the Truth can really be seen as a wake up call. You're piecing together those puzzle bits to create this picture that's very stark, and hopefully will spark people to action at whatever level they feel comfortable operating in. I think
Well,
that's what I took away from it.
amen to that. I couldn't have said it better myself. Um, I hope it is a wake up call for some people.
Yeah. So I want to check in to see if you're planning anything new coming up. This is your fourth book that you've done. So are you hard at work sort of thinking through what you want to do next or where you want to go?
Honestly, in terms of books, no, I'm not. I am trying to give myself a little space. The book only came out 3 days ago, so
Oh, come on.
usually,
You don't have
yeah,
it figured
it's
out?
if I look, I think any author would be lying if they said that even before their book comes out that they're not already like stressing about, will I ever be able to write another book? Will I ever find another good topic? So I'm definitely not immune to that. But I'm cutting myself a little slack this week at
Hmm.
least.
Well, cut yourself some slack. We're eager to see what you do next. And thank you for the reporting and the work that you've done for this. And hopefully we'll have you back again sometime soon. I hope.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.